Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm going to be doing something that I've been wanting to do for quite a while on this channel, and that is talking about the role that luck plays in the game of Survivor. And to do that here, I'll be running through every winner in the US series of the show and talking about the moment that I feel like they were the most benefited by luck. Now, the way I'm defining luck here is obviously situations that were outside of that player's control. Now, there won't be any obvious answers throughout this list of like, okay, the cast, which I think in general is probably the luckiest element of any Survivor winner, is the people that they're out there with. But then also, like, again, not going to put like, okay, they went on an immunity run or they found idols or anything like that, because again, that's just too easy of an answer. So again, this will be more so based around things that other players did that greatly benefited these winners, or maybe some production decisions. So with that, let's run through every season of the show, starting off with Survivor Borneo, talking about Richard Hatch. And for me, I think Richard Hatch has numerous things here that he gets very lucky by. I mean, one early on is the fact that Stacy is booted over Rudy, which obviously just inherently isn't a luck-based circumstance. However, considering what we know after the fact, where production was very incentivized to try to keep Rudy around, that is obviously something that greatly benefited Rich, giving him a number one ally moving forward. Also, Sean creating the alphabet strategy is something I would consider lucky, where despite Toggy not outright having the numbers, they were able to back off of this alphabet strategy in order to get certain people out, which again was something that Sean created entirely on his own. But really for me, I think the solid answers here come down to Kelly Wigglesworth. And I do debate which one is luckier here. The fact that Kelly flips at Final Four against Sue in a situation where she had no incentive to do so, and again was something that wasn't really prompted by anything Richard did, or was it the fact that Kelly won final immunity, where again, like I said, that I'm not going to be including someone in themselves winning immunity. However, I will very much be including other people winning immunity, where obviously Kelly winning final immunity essentially wins him the game, where if he had gotten to the end against Rudy, while I don't think it's impossible that he beats Rudy, it definitely is a tough road. And while obviously I agree with his decision to drop out of the final immunity challenge in order to not burn Rudy at the end, he is still putting the entire game in the hands of Kelly Wigglesworth by doing so, and banking on the fact that Kelly Wigglesworth wins final immunity. So again, that is definitely a luck-based circumstance that greatly benefited him. Next up for Tina, and again, I think Tina, there's a few things that would also quantify as being lucky. I think one is the fact that the information of Varner getting votes got leaked. Now we don't know exactly how it did, and that's why I definitely didn't make it the number one answer here, but again, was definitely up for debate. I think the big one that most people will talk about is Scoopin falling in the fire, and I mean, yes, it was very lucky, as it really 100% guaranteed that Ogakor was coming into emergent numbers. However, again, at the end of the day, it's like there still was at least a chance that Ogakor would have won final immunity, and in that case, they would have been in a very similar situation anyway. So I think for me, the answer here is again another immunity-based one, but not from Tina winning immunity, but more so from Tina not winning immunity, as I do think Tina not winning the final three immunity was something that was greatly beneficial to Tina's game, despite the fact that she was trying to win it. Again, it's not like a situation where she was trying to throw it, trying to give Colby a win. Like, she was actively trying to win and failed, but through her failing, she has Colby take her to the end, which again, this is a situation where Tina was also taking Colby to the end, which if she had done so would have been a bad look to the jury, considering she would have taken a big threat to the end, to which it would make it look like Colby manipulated her. But in this actual real life scenario where Colby takes her, it makes it look like Tina manipulated Colby. And that seemed to have a large impact on Jerry's vote in particular, where Jerry really props up Tina for being able to manipulate Colby there, which ends up giving her the win. And while like obviously there were other factors like Colby kind of giving up at Final Tribal that also led to him not getting any votes, I do feel like her not winning this final three immunity was definitely a very luck-based circumstance that greatly benefited her. Next up, we're moving on to Ethan, and Ethan to me has a very big glaring one, and that is the fact that Kim Johnson wins out. I think that is definitely the biggest element of luck in his game, where, again, he wanted to go to the end with Lex, to which Lex would have beat him. However, by Kim winning out, Kim takes him to the end, to which he ends up beating her. However, to even add to this, an even greater element of luck is the Final Four immunity challenge, where during that, one of the questions was written incorrectly, to which it should have been a tiebreaker between Lex and Kim. However, instead, Kim just outright wins there, Again, that's another element of luck. So really just this entire circumstance around Kim winning out at the end game there is something that greatly benefited Ethan, giving him the win in a position where he was actively trying to get himself into a position where he was going to lose. Next up, moving on to Marquesas, we have Vecepia. And I think this is another one. Very easy answer in the fact that we have the rock draw. But not necessarily who went home with the rock draw, but more so who didn't go home. Now, obviously, Pascal going home with the rock draw did greatly benefit it. Vecepia, as Pascal was someone that was going to beat Vecepia if they got to the end. But really, the greatest element of luck here is the fact that Nalia doesn't go home, as Nalia is the only person that Vecepia can even come close to beating, and she barely even beats Nalia at the end. And really, this is even more luck-based considering the fact that she wanted to vote out Nalia at the final four. Her plan was to vote with Kathy to take out Nalia, and fails at doing so because of the tie. She even tries to vote out Nalia at the final five as well. It's like her trying to get out Nalia and failing is essentially what ends up winning her the game, as that is the only person that she can win against at the end. Toward the final four, her plan was to go to 3 with Pascal and Kathy, who both beat her at the end if they get to the end with her. And even then, I don't think Pascal was taking her anyway. So I really feel like the entire final 4 round has some pretty bad decision making for Vecepia that she ends up kind of lucking her way out of. Next up, from Survivor Thailand, we have Brian Heidick, and I think this one's a bit more wonky. I'll be honest, I don't think there is a super solid answer with Brian Heidick. Now, the one that comes to mind right away of something that definitely benefited him is the fact that Ken doesn't blow up his spot, where obviously we know about the situation where Brian had told Ken at the merge that he didn't want another black player to win. Again, in Brian's mind, trying to manipulate Ken under the assumption that he has to be racist because he's a cop. And through doing so, Ken almost blows up Brian's spot at Final Tribal, but doesn't end up going through with it. I think that is definitely an element of luck. That, again, do I think it actually would have changed Ted's vote at the end? Probably not, considering, again, Ted was under the assumption that Clay was also a racist, to where I don't know if that one reveal would have been a reason for him to not vote for Brian over Clay, but it definitely would not help him. But really, I don't feel like Brian is a player that has any true inherent answer that comes to mind right away. Next up, moving on to Jenna, and again, taking out the immunity run element of it, I do feel like this one is also kind of more difficult. I think the Christie vote is definitely something that has some luck involved. Not necessarily in the fact that she gives up immunity to Heidi and then survives there, as again, that was due to an accurate read that Heidi was more likely to go home than her. However, I think the bigger element of luck is the fact that this plan came up at the very last second. Where Rob Cesarino has talked about this in the past, that right before Tribal, Christy ends up going to him and confirms to him that she's going to vote with him, which if he had known that earlier, he wouldn't have swapped his vote. So I think the timing of a lot of this is definitely a very luck-based circumstance for Jenna, where again, had this conversation happened before Rob had already told Jenna and Heidi to switch their votes to Christy, Jenna could have easily gone home from giving up her immunity necklace. And even if that had not happened and Heidi went home, Jenna would have been in a very precarious spot moving forward and would have been probably voted out of 5, considering she doesn't win immunity there. So I do feel like that is a massive luck-based circumstance. Next up, we're moving on to Sandra's Per Island game, and really the first one that comes to mind right away is again one that isn't really eligible for this list, but I'll still mention it here in the fact that Drake won the first immunity challenge, because if that had not happened, Sandra was supposedly the one that was going to go home. But I think the true answer for this video here is the Outcast twist. This is a twist that ends up giving the Drakes the majority after the merge, where if the Outcast twist did not happen, then Sean would have just flipped at the merge to the Morgans, to which they would have the advantage. And I think they are a group that is mostly solid, to where they're not nearly as dynamic of a group as Johnny, Fairplay, and Burton end up being, to which I think Sandra would have just been easily pagonged along the way. While obviously the inclusion of the Outcast twist ends up giving the Drakes the majority after a merge, to which obviously we get this much more sporadic endgame. So for me, that's the easy answer there. For Amber from All Stars, obviously there's things to mention okay, she was a non-factor her first time around, so she came in with no target. The fact that she falls in love with Boston Rob, and Rob's the one that ends up running the game. But I think the big thing here is the Lex and Rob relationship. The fact that Lex and Rob were so close in the pregame, to the point where Lex goes out of his way to save Amber. I think that is obviously a massive luck-based circumstance, as it's not like Amber got together with Rob because he had all these pregame relationships. That just so happened to be a benefit of it. And through that, Rob is able to save her, to where, again, not discrediting the work that she does, because she does do some good work on her own right, but I don't think any of that work would have been effective at all if it had not been for Rob telling Lex to save her to begin with. So I think the out-of-game relationship for Lex and Rob was definitely a great benefit to Amber there. Next up for Chris Doherty, and I mean, this one's pretty easy. I think it's the final 7 rounds. The fact that the women turn against each other in a position where he doesn't really do anything to perpetuate that. It's more so the thing that just naturally happens is obviously a massive luck-based circumstance. Also, I will say that I think another luck-based circumstance is the family visit, where the final 7 immunity challenge ends up involving the family visit, where his partner at the time ends up losing the challenge for him, and through that gained him some sympathy with the women, to where they felt bad about voting him out that round, which again had very little to do with what Chris was actively doing, more so of what Lori was doing. So again, like, those are massive luck-based circumstances, but really outside of that, I think Chris is actually a player that had some bad luck at points, but that's definitely the greatest element of good luck he had. Now going to Tom and Palau, and again, like, immunity run, you can mention that, considering the precise type of challenges that were on Palau, where they were very physical, which allowed Tom to have a massive advantage. But I mean, I think the true answer here is the producers allowing Oolong to go down to 1, to where I do think the producers intended to have a swap along the way, but then as they realized that Oolong was completely crumbling, they decided to just let it go. And through that allowed Tom to gain even more leverage on his group. And while it's obviously not as like game winning of a luck-based circumstance as many of the other ones we've just talked about, as to be honest, no matter what, either way, Karor was probably going to emerge with numbers. It definitely allowed Tom to face less adversity than what he had to. Next up, we're moving on to Danni Boatwright, and I think there's 2 easy answers here, both involving her immunity wins. Not the fact that she actually wins them, but the type of wins that they are. I mean, the first one's the auction, where this is the first ever auction to give away an advantage in an immunity challenge. And the fact that this is a thing that even happened that ends up leading to Danni winning the final 6 immunity, that ends up leading to her staying around in a position where she definitely would have been in a lot of danger, that is obviously a luck-based circumstance. Considering that was the thing that was pretty unprecedented at this point. The other thing is the final immunity challenge, but not the fact that she wins it, but the fact that it is like the perfect immunity challenge for her, where she has the perfect body build to outlast almost anybody in an endurance comp like this, while like someone like a Stephanie is too short, and because that greatly struggle on it, I think that's also a luck-based circumstance. So again, it's not the element of her winning immunity challenges, but the exact immunity challenges that they are, and circumstances around them that were very luck-based for Danni. Next up, moving on to Aras, and I think there's a couple things here. I think one, we have the complete opposite of what I just said about Danni going for Terry, where I think Terry had the worst possible final immunity challenge for him, where again, this is the element of luck that I talk about in immunity challenges, is you're really under the whim of whatever the producers decide to make the challenge. Like, there are different challenges that benefit different people. And if you're going on an immunity run, you're essentially banking on the fact that the producers are choosing challenges that all cater to you more than other people. And again, this is an instance where Terry had bad luck. He had a bad final immunity challenge, but through Terry having a bad immunity challenge, that greatly benefits Aras, as obviously that means he gets to the end without Terry, who is someone that would have beaten him. Also, the other element of luck for Aras is Danielle winning the fire making challenge, where had Suri won that fire making challenge, he goes to the end of Suri in a situation that is harder for him. I will say that I do think he has the advantage where it is a 3-3 vote with Courtney essentially deciding the game, and it technically could go either way. But again, like that versus the very clear win that he has against Danielle is obviously luck based as well. So again, I think there's a couple instances there in the end game for Aras. Next up for Yule, I mean, Yule has a lot, and that's why he's at the bottom of my top tier in my winner rankings, where despite how impressive a lot of the control that Yule has in the game, he does get very lucky with how the format of this season played out. First, I mean, let's mention some lesser twists. I mean, the surprise final 3, obviously greatly beneficial to him, especially the fact that the God Idol was available to be used at 4. That is ridiculous. He was essentially given a free road to the final 3. Now, do I think it would have played that much of a factor? Probably not, as either way he had Becky with him. At worst, he goes to fire making, to which he probably wins against Sandra. And then at final 2, he has the odds, but then again, Ozzy is Ozzy, so he probably still loses. But again, like I still think there's at least a path for him to manipulate Ozzy into taking him to the end. It's not like he's dead to rights, but it definitely gives him a harder path in the end game there. I think the big answer, though, is the bottle twist. And I think this is the very clear number one, probably one of the biggest elements of luck any winner has faced, especially from a production point of view, where I do tend to believe that the bottle twist was something the producers added in there to try to avoid the white people winning the game. Because again, like, it was just not a good look that the white people were dominating the railroad tribe, and they could have come into the merge way in numbers. Now, obviously, this is perpetuated by the mutiny, which was unlucky to a degree for Yule, but then also probably ends up being beneficial to him, because considering that means that he knows where Candace and Penner stand by the time of the merge, instead of being surprised when they eventually flip on him, and through that he probably wouldn't have had the leverage to negotiate with Penner at the merge, so that actually probably benefits him. But again, the bottle twist in itself, the fact that two people go out back to back on the other tribe made it so I2 came to their merge only down by 1. But even if we're saying that the bottle twist was always like a fair thing, it was always going to be a thing, if I2 had just lost that challenge, they're down 7-2. Like, Yule is screwed. There is no way Yule is making it further into the game, coming in the merge down 7-2, where yes, he has his idol, but that's only going to give him one round of safety. So again, to me, those are massive elements of luck for Yule's game. Next up for Earl, and I think there's some question marks here. I don't have a super solid answer. Like, obviously, there's the debate of, is the surprise final 3 something that benefited Earl? And I do think it's one of these situations where it did benefit him, but it wasn't a death knell if it didn't happen either. I think there could have been a way for him to make it to final 2 anyway. But I feel like the thing that I would like to point out is the starting twist. And really, the starting twist that was perpetuated by Melissa McNulty quitting the game. So I guess in essence, you could say it's that. So I'm talking about the twist where everyone starts on one beach for the first few days, which again, this was perpetuated by the fact that Melissa McNulty quit at the last second, which led to them kind of scrambling to figure out what to do for this first round. And through this twist, this leads to the creation of the builders versus explorers dynamic. That is something that's not mentioned on the show, but through exit press and everything, it's clear that it was a thing where half the tribe was essentially focused around building the shelter and bonded through that, while the other half of the tribe focused around exploring the island and bonded through that. And that greatly plays into the tribe dynamics, that greatly plays into how the tribes are split, that greatly plays into why Earl is able to gain so much leverage with Stacy, Boo, and Cassandra after a swap, where the majority alliance after a merge is all the people that he bonded with during those first 3 days, where he's essentially getting that group back together to take out the Alexes and Mookies of the world. So the fact that these relationships were even able to be established to begin with, which was all perpetuated by the fact they were all on the same starting island, which was perpetuated by the fact that Melissa McNulty quit, all is so luck-based. I think that is definitely something to mention here. Next up for Todd, and I think Todd is one that doesn't have a super solid answer. However, one that I did end up thinking of is the James boot, where I think the fact that PG did not leak the plan to James is a luck-based circumstance. Where again, at this point, it's not really death knell, because for all we know, James wouldn't have believed it and wouldn't have played his idols anyway. However, had PG and Eric gotten together, went to James, if James had played his idol at the final 7 there, it would have been very easy to knock Todd out of the game. And I don't think Todd was doing much work to stop that from happening. I mean, we do see PG herself end up voting for Todd. So again, I'm inclined to think this is a luck-based circumstance that this didn't end up going through. However, again, even if it did, I don't know if it would have worked out anyway, but the fact that it didn't even happen to begin with is something that can be looked at as luck-based. Now moving on to Parvati, and Parvati has 2 very easy answers. The first up is fair play quitting, where through fair play quitting, that makes it so the first round doesn't play out like normally, where it seemed like at least half the tribe was voting out Parvati. And while I do think now over time, it probably ends up being more likely that a fair play or even Eliza end up backing out of the tie by the end of it, considering I do think Suri was more solidly working with Parvati. It definitely is a bad position for Parvati to be in there, but I think the biggest element of luck has to be the final 2. Again, the surprise final 2, where Parvati more than likely loses against Suri. Again, this is a highly contested thing. I am inclined to think that Suri wins 3-2-2. It is very, very close though, but obviously through the vote out of Suri, it does lead to Parvati winning 5-3. And also, I guess you can kind of add Amanda's bad performance as a thing to add to Parvati's luck, to where I think if Amanda had given a good performance, I think she definitely could have gotten the vote of Eliza, to where it becomes a tie, and who knows at that point. Really, I think there's a lot of kind of wonky situations here. But to me, I feel like if I were to pick one answer, I would definitely say the surprise final 2, as the fact that she was actively striving to go to the final 3 with Suri and Amanda in a position where she more than likely loses is definitely not ideal and definitely an element of luck. Now moving on to Bob, and I think Bob has a couple here that are kind of humorous. First up, I think the surprise second swap that takes out Marcus, despite it being against what he personally wants at that point in the game, is something that greatly opens up the game to a point that leads to Bob winning. Where, had that not happened, Bob would have easily just been on the bottom of the Onion Alliance, who would have had a numbers coming to the merge, and he just would have been picked off along the way. Where obviously with Marcus gone, that opens up the game to where he eventually does win. The other thing is funnily him not winning final immunity, where if Bob had won final immunity, Susie would have been the easy boot, in which he would have gotten to a final 3 with him, Sugar, and Maddie, to which Maddie would have beaten him, considering Randy would have flipped in that situation. So by him losing the final immunity here, he gets into a situation where Sugar is Sugar and puts him in fire making against Maddie, to where he beats Maddie and through that ends up winning the game. But again, him not winning final immunity is again another thing that greatly benefited him, despite him not wanting it to happen. Next up, we're moving on to JT. And again, JT's another one that doesn't really have a blatant answer here. I don't think there's any element of luck outside of like him winning those final 2 challenges that would have been like life or death for him in the game. Where again, like I'm not including just the general cast as something to mention here. Again, I think that's obviously like one of the biggest elements of luck for JT. I think the thing I will mention here is probably the Exile Alliance crumbling. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think it really would have mattered, considering JT was able to get Brendan on his side really quickly and obviously still had Steven and Taj. But the fact that that grouping crumbles almost immediately really allows JT to build a stronger bond with Coach and Tyson, through that being the way that Jalapao ends up going with. And he really secures Coach's and Debbie's vote through that. And I guess that's an element of luck, but to be honest, it would have worked out for him anyway. So, I mean, really, I don't think there is a solid answer for JT. Outside of, again, the fundamentals of things I already mentioned aren't going to be answers on this video. Next up, moving on to Natalie White. And again, this one's kind of easy in the sense that I think like with players like Natalie, it's like the biggest element of luck is the success of the people that they are playing behind. Again, Natalie is a player that is 100% banking on Russell succeeding to take her to the end, to where she will win due to being a more likable figure. And again, that is something she does actively, but she is still actively banking on luck. She is banking on the success of Russell, as if Russell had not been successful in flipping the power structure, then Natalie's just pagonged alongside the other Foas. But because Russell is successful, she's able to get to the end with him, to which she ends up winning. However, we're looking at like one individual moment. I feel like an even bigger moment is just the fact that Russell beats Brett in final immunity, where I think that is just a clear-cut case. She loses if Brett wins final immunity, where Brett would get to the end, he would demolish her in a jury vote. But because Russell wins final immunity, that allows her to get to the end where she wins. So really, I feel like a lot of her luck is based around things that Russell was doing over what she was actively doing. Next up, moving on to Sandra, and I think there's a couple things here. I think one is the fact that she fails at flipping against Russell in a position where if she had successfully flipped against Russell, she probably would have lost, as at that point the heroes would have the numbers, and she would probably lose against all the heroes, considering the heroes would vote for each other, and then even the villains, a lot of them didn't really respect Sandra at that point. So I think something like Russell convincing Candace to flip at the final 9 is something that ends up greatly benefiting Sandra, despite it being against what she perceives to be in her best interest. And I think an element of luck that isn't talked about as much, that is the reason why she even gets their merge to begin with, is the fact that Courtney just had better pregame relationships than her, which is a lot of the reason why Courtney gets voted out. I mean, Courtney had obviously a relationship with Amanda from her time on China, had a relationship with JT through her dating Stephen Fishback at the time, and through it, that is like the main reason why Courtney is taken out over Sandra right before the merge, is due to all these friendships Courtney had with these other people, while Sandra had Rupert at best. Now, I will say that part of this is also perpetuated by the fact that they could only take out one of the two by the time of the merge, because Sandra was successful in getting Russell paranoid against Coach. So she did do some things actively well to get into that position to begin with, but the fact that position ends up working out for her is something that I don't think Sandra fully expected to happen in the way that happened, and I think that is still an element of luck. Now from Nicaragua, with Fabio here, I think the biggest answer here is obviously the double quit. I mean, double quit benefits him in so many ways. First, it gets him 2 rounds closer to the end, to where he nearly wins out from that point forward. He really only survives the final 7 round without semblance of immunity. And had the double quit not happen, he would need to win 2 extra immunity challenges, which I think are very unlikely for Fabio to actually be able to do. So again, that's definitely the biggest element of luck. I mean, like I also mentioned, the fact that they were able to vote at the end, which isn't necessarily luck considering there was precedent beforehand with Janu, but had they not been able to vote on the jury, Nyanka and Kelly, Fabio loses as well. He would have lost in a 4-3 vote, so that's also something to mention here. So again, I just think the double quit all around was something that greatly benefited Fabio. Next up, we got Boston Rob in Redemption Island, and really it's kind of funny how with a lot of these aspects of luck, a lot of these tend to be things that happen towards the end of the game. Well, with Boston Rob's here, a lot of this is what happens early on in the game, where again, you can bring up the cast argument. I don't agree with it, but again, you can bring that up with Boston Rob. I think one thing that was greatly beneficial to him was the fact that he picked the Ometepe buff. I think Zapatera is actually a group of pretty competent players, and I feel like Rob would not have been able to get the leverage he had on Ometepe if he was on Zapatera to begin with. That's obviously an element of luck. Obviously, also Zapatera throwing the challenge to get rid of Russell, which I think just in general isn't that bad of a move, especially not like this detrimental move that the edit tries to claim, because considering Zapatera like still won challenges without Russell anyway, but Zapatera throwing that one precise immunity challenge definitely made it so that Ometepe could come into the merge with numbers, which is obviously something that greatly benefits Rob. And then also I think something that isn't as mentioned is the fact that Matt returns over Sarita from Redemption Island, which is something that again greatly benefits Rob. While Matt is someone that did consider flipping against Rob, he doesn't end up doing so, and is someone that is very much plagued with this need to play honestly, and because that gave Rob a lot of leverage to use at that merge vote and voting out Matt, which ends up benefiting his game moving forward, putting fear into all of his alliance and what would happen if they turned on him. Well, like if Sarita had returned the game, that would actually give Zapatera another number to where they would be potentially going to rocks coming into tribal. So again, I think those are the main luck-based circumstances. Again, all of them happen before the merge vote itself. Those are definitely luck-based circumstances for Rob. Next up, we're moving on to Sophie, and just like that, we're going straight to the end game stuff. Something that does greatly benefit her, and again, it's something that Sophie did very little to actually get, is the fact that Brandon does give away immunity, where I'm not saying that Sophie would go home that round, as I actually don't think that would be the case. It did seem like Albert would have gone home. However, something that does greatly benefit her is the fact that Albert is still in the game over Brandon. Albert's someone that is more willing to work with her moving forward, and also someone that has a closer relationship to her, and is also someone that has no real winning chances either over Brandon, who is someone that, again, isn't as close to her, is more in Coach's back pocket, and someone that would demolish her in a jury vote. So I think that's obviously a luck-based circumstance there, and that Brandon isn't making it further into the game. But really, I think the biggest element of luck comes down to Coach. And again, in a similar thing that I said with Natalie and Russell, I mean, I think it's a similar thing with Sophie and Coach. I don't think as deep, as I do think Sophie was a lot more active in the game. I think she was a lot more important to keeping the alliances together. However, I think the fact that Coach doesn't own up his game at Fallen Tribal is an element of luck. Now, obviously, this is something that, again, Sophie was banking on. Sophie was banking on Coach being Coach and not being able to own up to his game and through that lose the game. However, she could not know 100% that this was going to happen. I mean, it was still luck that it doesn't happen, as again, like considering how much Coach changed up his game from the first 2 times he played, for all she knows, he changed up his approach and how he talks about his game. So yeah, I do think there's still an element of luck in that as well. Next up, we're moving on to Kim, and again, Kim is one that I think there's a lot of like more minor elements of luck to mention. Again, like the men giving away immunity early on, I think that's definitely something to mention. I will say I don't think it plays that big of a factor at the end of the day, as really like Christina probably goes home. It gives her one less number to work with, obviously, but I don't think it's a complete death knell either. I think the same thing with the Colton medevac, where obviously, that makes it so Colton doesn't make the merge, gets rid of one of her biggest oppositions. However, at the same time, it's Colton who already started to lose some leverage by the time he left, to where I do feel like the new Solani was going to stick together post-merge anyway. So I would actually not be that surprised if Colton was the merge boot either way. Also, we have the swap working out like perfectly for Kim, where she literally gets swapped into having 4 of her closest allies with her, and then also being able to bond with 3 of the more strategically minded men, which really allows her to get the stranglehold she has coming into her merge. So I think that's like an element of luck as well. But really, to me, I don't think there's any like blatant scenarios where it's really night and day between what would happen with these scenarios and not, as I think either way, Kim was probably poised to win the game anyway. Next up, we're moving on to Denise, and I think this one has a very easy answer in the fact that Penner turns down Lisa's deal. I mean, Penner could have very easily gotten the 4 with Carter, Scoopin, and Lisa if he just said yes. But because he says no, Lisa and Scoopin go to Malcolm and Denise to make the final 4 deal, which ends up getting them the final 4. And I think that's obviously a massive element of luck. I mean, again, if Penner had just said yes, Denise probably goes at final 6, final 7, somewhere around that spot. So again, she really just lucked out from Penner making a really suboptimal move for his game. Next up, we're moving on to Cochran. And I think this one's very difficult because, again, I'm not including cast because I do think the cast that he was with was something that greatly benefited him, obviously. I do think also just the pre-game perception is something that greatly benefited him. The fact that he was coming in, being looked at as a mostly likable figure, but one that also didn't play a good game and one that I think, like, again, for the most part, didn't really have any massive negatives to him coming into a return here outside of just physical strength. But in terms of like in-game things, like there's very few things I can even like really mention where really I think there's like unlucky things that happen to Cochran. In the fact that like he loses Philip as early on as he does, and the fact that like Eric hands the idol to Andrea. I guess you can mention like the Eric medevac, which I know a lot of people mention. I don't even think this was that big of a deal though, where I just think Eric gets voted out anyway. And even if Eric like wins final immunity, it's like the votes wouldn't have been there to get rid of Cochran outright anyway. Like at worst he's going to fire against Sherry, and you know that's really at worst. I think more than likely Eric would have just gone to the end of Cochran and lost. So it's like, I mean, I guess that's the answer, but it's really not that good of one. Next up, we're moving on to Tyson, and I mean, obviously we got the rock draw. I mean, that is obviously a massive element of luck, but also to be fair, I feel like there were elements of bad luck that got Tyson into that position to begin with, precisely in the fact that Jervis couldn't keep his mouth shut. But again, the rock draw is literally a luck-based circumstance. It's literally luck that decides everything. I think he's also one of these people that got like such a perfect swap configuration that greatly benefited him and allowed him to set up his power structure moving forward, to where he ends up getting swapped with all the singles and is able to make this like very blatant singles alliance. So that's something that obviously greatly benefited him as well. Now moving on to Tony in Cagayan. And really, I feel like obviously there's the more blatant elements of luck in the fact that he draws the rock at the auction that allows him to find the idol that keeps it out of Spencer's hands, which gives him a lot of power. Also the fact that Wu wins final immunity in a situation where I had Cass won final immunity, which she was like a second away from doing. She would have voted out Tony and Wu would have won. So again, that's a luck-based circumstance. And like that's definitely like a very solid answer. I will also say that I think the fact that Trish is able to flip over Cass is also probably a big answer as well. The fact that Cass and Sarah had this animosity and then Trish is able to use that to flip Cass over. Again, like I think that's something that Tony had very little to actually do, yet it benefits him more than literally anyone else there. So really, again, I feel like the flipping of Cass and the Wu winning final immunity, those are probably the two biggest answers, with the final immunity one being one that he literally wins the game in one scenario and then loses in the other. Next up, we got Natalie Anderson. I think Natalie Anderson's another one of these people that like doesn't have any blatant elements of luck that would have greatly impacted her game. Yeah, I think there's things like Julie quitting at the merge, which like on paper is bad as like her side loses a number, but she was literally about to lose Jeremy, which would have been worse. So the fact that she keeps Jeremy in the game, gets rid of Julie, that's an element of luck, but it doesn't really play that big of a factor outside of getting Jeremy on the jury. I think probably the bigger example to me is the fact that John gets exiled on the Josh boot round, which leads to Jacqueline being on her own and deciding to flip against Koyopa, which I don't think that would have happened had John been there and been able to convince her back. And I think that's obviously an element of luck for Natalie Anderson, in the sense that obviously that means that John and Jacqueline end up siding with her side. But really, I feel like the early merge didn't really matter too much, as I feel like John and Jacqueline were always going to flip back and forth to get rid of both Josh and Jeremy. It's just a matter of like the order of it. So again, like I don't really feel like there is a solid answer for Natalie Anderson. But again, these are some like pretty minor things. Next, I'm moving on to Mike Holloway. And again, like obviously the easy answer here is him finding an idol and also winning challenges. Like that is the big answer. But I do feel like there are elements around him winning out that are also luck based. I mean, first, the fact that Joe loses Final 10 immunity, which if he doesn't, I think Mike would be in serious danger. Again, if Joe wins Final 10 immunity, then one, I mean, Mike is a potential boot that week. But even if not, then that means Joe is still there to face off against Mike in these challenges that Mike needs to stay in the game. Also, I think the makeup of these challenges is also beneficial to Mike. For if you pay attention to the competitions that he wins, they're mostly like physical challenges that have like a puzzle element to them, where he only wins one endurance comp the entire season, and that endurance comp ends up being one that's split between men and women, where he wins for the men. But the other endurance comp that he participates in the end game is the only other comp that he ends up losing, and he loses to Carolyn. So I will say that I do think the makeup of these immunity challenges is something that screams out to me as something that is greatly beneficial to Mike, to where I feel like if there was just one other standard endurance comp in that end game stretch, I do feel like Carolyn probably would have beaten Mike in that, and Mike probably would have gone home. So again, I feel like those are definitely elements of luck for Mike. Next up, moving on to Jeremy, and I think Jeremy's another tough one where I don't really have a super solid answer, because again, I feel like there are a lot of things that happen that you can point out, but like, again, like, I don't know how much of a negative it really is for him at the end of the day. Things like Stephen Fishback finding the steal a vote, which puts like a massive target on Stephen's back, which makes Stephen like the priority to take out over Jeremy, but like, realistically, were they ever going to take out Jeremy at that point in the game? Also, things like Jeremy eventually listening to Spencer and Tasha to vote for Kimmy, which ends up saving him there. How much of that was like truly luck? So again, I feel like Jeremy is one that's kind of tough to truly gauge, like what individual moment was truly lucky for him. Like, I do think he gets a good cast for him, especially a very good starting tribe for him. But really, outside of things like that, I don't know what the solid answer really is here. Next up, moving on to Michelle, where again, very easy answer if comp wins. But outside of that, I mean, we get another very easy answer of the Joe Medevac, where had the Joe Medevac not happen, the Final 5 immunity would have been what the Final 4 reward was, which is a competition that Aubrey ends up winning, which means she would have been the very easy boot at Final 5. But because Joe gets Medevac, that gets turned to a reward challenge, and she ends up winning the final 2 challenges of the season. So again, that one for me is pretty clear cut. It's one, she wins the game, one, she loses the game. I think that's the easiest answer there. Next up, we move on to Adam in Millennials vs. Gen X. And again, easy answer of the rock draw. I would also argue like certain other minor things like David making the fake idol for Jay, which caused Jay to not look for the real idol, which had Jay survive that round. That would have definitely been a bad spot for Adam. Also, I think the fact that Ken ends up flipping on David, which I never really gave much credit to Adam for doing so. I actually think Adam was probably the least integral of the 3 people involved in getting Ken to flip there, where I think Hannah and Ken himself were more involved in that decision than Adam was. So that's another thing for me to bring up. So I feel like those are definitely luck-based circumstances for Adam. Next up, we got Sarah Lucina in Game Changers, and this one's pretty easy. I think the entire ruling around the legacy advantage is the easy one here, where Aussie advantage again ends up happening at the final 6 here. However, it just so happens that the legacy advantage is also only good for the final 6 round. And while again, it is good work that Sarah does to get the legacy advantage from Sierra, the fact that it literally ends up being the final 6 round itself that is eligible to be used ends up being a massive element of luck. Where had it been only available to be used at the final 7 round or final 5 round, Sarah Lucina goes home, or is at least in a lot of danger during this final 6 round. I still feel like there's a massive element of luck on Sarah's end. Next, I'm moving on to Ben, and I mean, this is like the easiest one on the board. Obviously, forced fire making. I mean, if that didn't get introduced, he was literally gone. He had no clue what was happening. Really gets lucked out by this last second twist being added to the game. Easy answer there for Ben. Next up, moving on to Wendell, and I feel like there's a couple things here. Like a minor element of luck comes from the split tribal, where while Wendell does do good work in splitting up Kellen and Laurel, which ends up being really effective moving forward in the game, it also does cause Kellen to put 2 votes on Laurel on that tribal, to where had Michael also put his vote on Laurel, which would not have been out of the realm of possibility, considering from Michael's perspective, him and Laurel were on the bottom. That would have caused Laurel to go home in that round, which would have been greatly detrimental to Wendell's game moving forward. So that's a bit of luck, and I think also an element of luck is the fact that Angela even ends up voting for him at the end, which, again, like, this is a thing that's been documented pretty well in exit interviews, that The reason why Angela ends up voting for Wendell, because she was unsure of who she was going to vote for right before she cast her vote. So she looked at the final three, and Wendell was looking back at her while Dominic wasn't. And that's how she made her decision. Again, massive element of luck of him getting Angela's vote, which ends up causing the tie to begin with. So again, I feel like those are the answers for Wendell. Next up, moving on to Nick. And Nick has a very easy one, obviously, in the Pat medevac. Pat did not get medevac. Nick would have been in a lot of danger. I won't go to say that I think for sure he would have gone home, as I do feel like he definitely would have had people that would have fought for him to stay, but definitely would have been in a lot of danger. Also, I do feel like he gets lucky in the fact that Mike lays down his game at the end, where you can clearly tell that Mike didn't fight as hard as what he could have at Final Tribal because he felt bad about taking away the money from someone like Nick, someone that needed the money more. So I think that's also kind of an element of luck, but I mean, realistically, I think the Pat medevac is obviously the true answer here. Next up, Chris Underwood. I mean, what do you think? Obviously, he had the Edge of Extinction, a twist that no one even knew about until the merge, and even beyond that, is still a thing that was not on any season beforehand. So obviously gets greatly benefited from a unprecedented twist, and also gets benefited from being essentially handed an idol to use at the Final Five, which, again, does impressive work to get to that position in the Final Five to begin with, but again, still definitely something to mention here as well. Now moving on to Tommy, and Tommy is an interesting figure because I feel like Tommy is one of the most unlucky winners in the history of the show, where I feel like so many things go wrong for Tommy. He gets bad swaps, he loses Dan in a position where he was primed to just steamroll the end game, but instead has to narrowly get Janet and Lauren out by the end. So while I feel like obviously you would mention, the fact that Lauren lost fire making was an element of luck, and the fact that Dean had the idol nullifier is an element of luck, like those are, but it was also perpetuated by the fact that Tommy got very unlucky that Dan got ejected. If Dan didn't get ejected, he would have had an easy path in voting out Janet at 6 and then voting out Lauren at 5. But I mean, I think the thing to mention here is the fact that Dean did get the idol nullifier through a coin toss. I think that's obviously ends up being a massive element of luck. That was literally a 50-50 chance of Dean even getting the idol nullifier. So I think that's a funny thing to mention here. But really, for the most part, I think Tommy's one of the most unlucky players to ever play the game. And that leads to another player that I think also has a similar element of unluckiness to their game, and that is Tony. Where again, I feel like the lucky elements of Tony's game come from things that happened after the Edge of Extinction return, which is something that greatly harmed his game. I think something that you can consider some element of luck is the fact that a bigger legacy player didn't return. The fact that you didn't get the Boston Robs or a Parvati or even like a Sandra, or some of these like really, really massive names returned from the Edge, to where if Boston Rob had been able to make it to the end after having returned from the Edge, I do think it would have given Tony a bigger run for his money at the very end there. Also, I think the bigger element of luck is the fact that Sarah ends up voting out Ben, which is obviously something he didn't want to happen, and on paper you don't want to happen. But by the time Natalie wins final immunity, that means that essentially if Sarah didn't vote out Ben, Tony would be facing off against Ben in fire making, to which Ben would naturally win. Now, Ben could also throw it, which wouldn't be that surprising. But again, that is definitely like some luck-based circumstances. But again, all these luck-based circumstances are propelled by the fact that Edge of Extinction existed to begin with, and that Tony gets very unlucky at multiple points throughout the game from the Edge of Extinction, from the returnee, and from the extortion disadvantage, and things like that. That again, it's elements of luck, but it's definitely things that are perpetuated by elements of unluckiness. Now for 41, we have Erica, who at the time I looked at her as an extremely lucky winner, and there are still things to mention here. But I will say that as time goes on, like the fact that we learn more through Exit Press and everything, it does seem a bit more hazy on things like the Hourglass Twist, where, yeah, she was being talked about as the target had the Hourglass Twist not happen, but that was obviously perpetuated by one, her not even being at camp to defend herself, but then also, it doesn't really look like it would have gone through by the end of it. I will still mention the Final 5 advantage, as I do think the advantage she gets there does obviously give her a leg up on Ricard in the Final Immunity Challenge, to where she beats him and through that has a more easy win at the end, to where if Ricard had one immunity there, Erica could simply just go home at 4. But even if she gets the end against Ricard, it would have been a close vote. It would have been very close. So that's something to mention. And then I think also the fact that Nasir not throwing the immunity challenge that they end up winning despite most of the tribe wanting to throw it, I think is something to mention, though again, like at the end of the day, it does seem like we're at the point where the common consensus is that Sydney was actually going to go home, not Erica, but Erica would have been the target for Sydney, and like who really knows exactly what went on there, as really it would have been a battle between like Danni and Deshawn on who gets to keep their pawn. So again, it's like there are elements of luck to point out, but I feel like these elements of luck also have things negating them as well, so it's kind of a mixed bag here. Finally, let's wrap it up by talking about the most recent winner in Marianne, who I don't have 100% solid of an answer with, because I do feel like most of my answers here kind of conflict with my initial rules. I mean, I think one that can come to mind is Mike not owning up to his game in a similar way that I talked about with Sophie, with her being benefited by Coach not doing so. However, I feel like this is a situation where even if Mike had owned up to his game, I think Marianne's final tribal performance could have still clinched her to win, to where like that's not even a guaranteed thing. Also, I would say like probably the biggest element of luck for Marianne, especially in getting through a lot of the early portion of the game, is the fact that she had Jonathan on her tribe, who was so dominant in team challenges that had it not been for Jonathan on Taku, I do not think Marianne makes the merge, considering she was on the bottom the entire time, would have gone home had they ever gone the tribal. So I think she was greatly benefited from having Jonathan on her tribe, but also that plays into not picking like an obvious answer that is related to casting. So I think probably the answer I'm gonna give here is the fact that Lindsay doesn't win Final 5 immunity, which like normally would be a bit of an iffy answer, but I do think it's even more luck-based for Marianne, considering she actually helps Lindsay get the advantage at Final 5, where she purposely slows down everyone else so that Lindsay can get the advantage, and through Lindsay not winning the Final 5 immunity, she gets taken out in a position where she was probably the biggest jury threat on the board, and that allows Marianne to get to the end against people who she was going to beat anyway. So I think that's probably the answer, but again, there are definitely some wonky answers here considering my criteria, but there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on the luckiest moments for every winner of Survivor US, which again is a video I've been wanting to do for a while. Obviously, luck plays such a major factor into Survivor, but I do think this was an interesting rundown of going through the non-inherent elements of luck that led to the eventual wins for each of the winners of Survivor. There we go. Obviously, moving forward, I'll continue to do Survivor Big Brother videos, so stay tuned for those. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.